Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed your Veterans Day break. Clearly appears that many of your classmates decided to extend their Veterans Day break, but be that as it may, we're all here. So, last Thursday, as you'll recall, we were talking about some of the issues regarding monetary policy when the economy is hit by various kinds of shocks. Aggregate demand shocks, short-run aggregate supply shocks, long-run aggregate supply shocks. And we saw that for an inflation-targeting central bank, there were no particular real issues if the shocks to the economy were either aggregate demand or they were long-run aggregate supply. At least no issues in reconciling targeting inflation versus targeting the unemployment rate. However, we did see that there was a trade-off when the central bank is faced with a short-run aggregate supply shock, because that kind of a shock increases both inflation and unemployment. And so central bank had a dilemma, what to do. So one of the things that we want to do today is talk about how to think about how the central bank should react in such a situation. That'll be something known as the Taylor rule. The second thing that we want to talk about is that everything that we've discussed about monetary policy up to this point has always been under the assumption that the central bank could actually change the real interest rate by changing the nominal interest rate. But as we've discussed before, the nominal interest rate has a floor to it. The nominal interest rate can only go to zero. And of course, for the United States, the nominal interest rate has basically been at zero since the end of 2008. So one of the things that we need to continue to look at is what does the central bank do, or can do, once the nominal interest rate has hit what we call the zero lower bound. So we want to look at that and talk about monetary policy at that particular point. Now, I didn't put it in there. Talk amongst yourself for a minute. You can stop talking amongst yourselves now. So before we get into some heavy-duty new information, I'd like to talk a little bit about your exam. Everybody take a deep breath. Put down all sharp instruments. Okay, so here are the results for exam 2 across discussion sections. So I would only point out a couple of things. One is the results across discussion sections were very similar, which means nobody did really, really well, nobody did really, really poorly compared to the other GSIs, both in terms of taking the exam as well as the average scores. The second thing I would point out, and this is more of a reminder than anything that you'll see up there, I grade on a curve. Okay, deep breath. I grade on a curve. So what you should be looking at is your score versus your GSI's median score. That'll tell you, are you doing better than half your GSI's discussion sections or worse? You can also see from the standard deviations how far away from that median that you might be. In general, median is somewhere around a B. Somewhere around a B, right? So that doesn't mean an A, that doesn't mean a C, but it means maybe a B plus, maybe a B minus, right? So we can see what that means. Okay, now, the other thing that I looked at was your weighted average scores to date. So this is first 4 problem sets and first 2 exams. Okay? So same information. Now, this is out of only 65 points, right? Because that's what we've had. 20% on the first exam, 25% on the second exam, 4 problem sets worth 5 points each, so 65%. So once again, notice the means and medians are fairly close to each other, which means that there's not a wide gap between student performance and the various GSIs. The standard deviations are also reasonably close, although there's a bit more variation there. Now, you may notice, for those of you who are in Andres's discussion section, that there are no scores, because as you are well aware, he has not finished grading problem sets 3 and 4, which he tells me he will have finished by Monday. So I will send out to you these weighted average scores for Andres's section. Okay? So that's where we are. Now, keep in mind a couple of things. One is, we still have one more exam to go. Right? That one exam is worth 30% of your grade. 30%. So no matter where you are, messing up or doing really well in the final can make a difference to your grade. So if you've done really well so far, you can't relax. If you've done less than you would like to do, you still have some room for improvement. The final exam is not cumulative. Unless, of course, you would like a cumulative exam, in which case I'm perfectly happy to write you one, either as an individual or for the whole class. So just let me know. But if I hear from nobody, I'll assume that it is a non-cumulative exam. That means it will focus on the material that we've covered since exam 2. Now, if you look at a calendar, one of the things that you'll see is we have a total of basically 6 lectures between exam 2 and our final exam. So that's not a lot of material. It's basically chapters 13, 16, 17, and 20-something or other. I can never remember what it is. So basically 4 chapters that we'll be covering, and only 6 lectures. So it can't be a lot of new material. Everything that we're doing in this final third of the course is simply a variation on our aggregate supply and demand model. Right? So you already know the basic model. There are no brand new models. Right? So everything's built on aggregate supply and demand model. What will be different is some of the assumptions that we make, or some of the assumptions that we've made in the past that we will now relax. Or there will be special conditions. But that's all that we're going to be doing. Keep in mind also, the final exam will have the same structure as the previous 2 exams. You will have 10 multiple choice questions. You will have 2 analytical questions. Same structure, same length. However, you will have 3 full hours to take the exam. Okay? So if one of your issues in the past has been time, it just didn't seem like you had enough time to get everything down in 80 minutes, and that made you very nervous, which probably also didn't help your score, now you're going to have 3 hours to do it. So 3 hours, you can relax, you can slow down a little bit. Hopefully you can relax. You can definitely slow down a little bit. You can get everything done in that time period. Right? By the way, because you have 3 hours doesn't mean you need to take all 3 hours. So just keep that in mind. Now, as you probably know, our final exam is scheduled for Tuesday, December, somebody help me out here, 16, 11:30 to 2:30. Eat well before you come. Don't come to class on an empty stomach. And we'll be in Wheeler Auditorium. I will send that out. So, and mention that several times between now and then. Okay? Yes? I could. I won't. But I could. Yeah. That's just part of my meanness. I'm sorry. Okay. So, let's talk about variations on a theme. So remember, we've been talking about stabilization policy here. So one of the issues, or some of the controversies that exist in stabilization policy, have to do with the fact that the goals of stabilization policy are actually fairly well agreed upon. We'd like to have the economy at potential, we'd like to have the unemployment rate at the natural rate, and we'd like to have low and stable inflation. Right? So almost everybody agrees that those should be the major goals for stabilization policy. Where the disagreements come about is, how do we get there? What are the means of getting there rather than the ends themselves? One of those disagreements, of which, by the way, there are many, has to do with economists being able to drop into one of 2 categories that, for stabilization policy, we basically call non-activists and activists. Right? So non-activists actually believe that the economy's self-correcting mechanism works very rapidly, and therefore any deviation from potential output gets self-corrected back to potential output very rapidly. This would, of course, suggest that the short-run aggregate supply curve is relatively steep, that wages and prices are relatively flexible, and if that's true, then there's not really much need for the government to undertake stabilization policies. Right? The economy is going to get back to potential output very, very rapidly. So why do anything? So notice that very flexible wages and prices put most economists who consider themselves classical economists into this camp. Most classical economists would be what we consider non-activists. Let the economy play out the way it's going to play out under its normal adjustment mechanism. However, the activist would actually argue, wait a minute, wages and prices aren't all that flexible, especially in a large, modern, developed economy. Right? And if wages and prices are not particularly flexible, the short-run aggregate supply curve will be relatively flat. The adjustment mechanism will still take place, but after any sort of shock to the economy, it'll take a much longer period of time to get back to potential output. If that's the case, then the activists would argue government policies, whether monetary or fiscal policy, should be used to shorten the adjustment period. Let's shift the aggregate demand curve, whichever way it needs to be moved, in order to get the economy back to potential output more quickly. That'll reduce the total amount of unemployment that exists during that period of time. Most Keynesian economists would make this argument, right? That wages and prices are relatively sticky, therefore there is an argument to be made for a government policy to get the economy back to potential quickly. In fact, this was exactly the argument that John Maynard Keynes made in the 1930s to get the UK out of the Depression. Now, it's also important in this debate about active versus non-active policy to recognize that any policy that gets adopted and implemented has to deal with certain kinds of timing issues. It's impossible for policymakers to act contemporaneously with any sort of shock to the economy. It's not that they can't recognize a shock when it happens. Oftentimes we can, although not always. Some shocks are actually relatively small. But what we do need to recognize is that we can't tell that something's going wrong with the economy without data. Right? We have to have observation points. So those observation points mean we need to have data. To have data, we have to collect data. Most data is not collected instantaneously. Right? So it takes time to collect data. Last Friday, the Labor Department reported out employment and unemployment for October. So it didn't take long to find out what was happening in the labor market in October. But if we thought about GDP, here we are in the middle of the fourth quarter, we won't find out what happened to fourth quarter GDP until the end of January. And even then, we know it's going to be revised in the subsequent 2 months. So we're not going to have a really good handle on what happened to fourth quarter GDP until the end of March of next year. So we need to collect data. It takes time to collect data. The second thing we need to recognize is even after we've collected the data, how long or how many data points does it take before we're reasonably confident that a change has happened, a shock has occurred that we need to respond to? Right? So remember that the data that come in on the economy, and we get lots and lots of data at the macro level, often give us a conflicting picture. It's not that it's 100% showing the economy growing or 100% showing that the economy is declining. We might get 60 or 70% of very positive data points and maybe 20% negative data points and a bunch of neutral ones. Or it might flip the other way around. It's also the case that the data is quite noisy from month to month. So in any given month, when the data pop up or drop down, doesn't necessarily mean it's a change in the trend of the data. So what we really want to ask ourselves then is, if we've got all this data, how do we kind of put it all together? How do we look for the broader trends in the data? And when are we confident that that trend has changed? Do we only need a single month's worth of data? One data point does not a trend make. How about 2 points? 2 data points. How about 3? How long does that take? Well, it turns out it generally takes 3, 4, 5 months. So notice, if it takes a month to collect the data, and then you want to have a number of data points, 4 or 5, maybe 2, before you can assess the situation, notice that just between what we call the data lag and the recognition lag, 6 months might go by. Right? Before we know that the shock has actually happened, that it has significant size, and that it's more or less permanent. Right? Didn't happen one month and get reversed the following month. Now we need to do something about it. Doing something about it is what we refer to as the legislative lag. The legislative lag says we've recognized the problem, we've talked about what to do about it, and we've made a decision to do something. Okay? And we might even say that we have done something. Now, the legislative lag turns out to be relatively short for monetary policy, but, at least in the United States, relatively long for fiscal policy. So if there's a shock to the economy, and we want to use fiscal policy, change taxes, change government spending, Congress needs to pass a bill to do all of this. What? Right? The House is going to pass one bill, the Senate's going to pass another bill, they'll argue back and forth, the Senate won't bring up the House's bill, they'll go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, 10 years goes by, they're still going back and forth, whatever it might be, eventually they've got to come up with a bill, send it to the President, he's got to sign it before anything happens. So for fiscal policy, the legislative lag can be, doesn't have to be, but it can be quite long, simply because the bureaucratic structure in the United States is such that it takes a long time to get all of that stuff done. Now, I've emphasized in the United States, because in countries with parliamentary forms of government, it doesn't take nearly as long. In the United Kingdom, for example, when there's a shock that's been recognized and the government wants to respond to, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who's the equivalent to our Secretary of the Treasury, would simply go to the House of Commons with a new budget. It would have different tax rates, it would have different government spending, and the House of Commons would vote it up or down that day. There wouldn't be all this interminable delays that we see in the United States. So it can operate much more quickly than what we see in the United States, although, generally speaking, it still doesn't. Okay, so that's the legislative lag. Now keep in mind, monetary policy, in the United States we have all of 19 people who have to agree on something before they do it. So obviously that's much easier to get together to agree on something. They don't have to go back and forth with different bills. It doesn't have to go to the president. They can enact those kinds of policies. Now, once those policies have been agreed on, how long does it take before they actually go into place? Once again, monetary policy is fairly short on the implementation lag, while fiscal policy is generally much longer. When the central bank decides to engage in open market operations to change the real interest rate, they send the directive to the open market desk at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and they execute it that day. So they can make a decision. It gets implemented in a matter of hours, very, very quickly. But think about a tax cut. Let's suppose that we were going to reduce tax rates on working individuals. So what happens? Congress passes it, the president signs it into law, everybody's taxes go down immediately. No. So the first thing that happens is the Internal Revenue Service has to figure out what the new tax rates are going to be, how much withholding should change in everybody's paychecks. Then the IRS needs to communicate that information to employers so that they can change the rules, software rules, for deductions that take place out of your paycheck. And then the employee has to actually notice, oh, my paycheck changed. And then they have to start spending it. Well, that can take quite a while. Another fiscal policy feature that we've used in the past, and we'll talk more about in a couple of weeks, is let's send rebate checks to everybody. Right? So Congress passes it, the president signs it. Now the IRS has to figure out, okay, we've got to go through everybody's income tax form, find out their name, address, their family status, because that tells us how big the check is going to be. They need to get all those checks printed out. They need to actually mail them out. All of that takes several months to get implemented. Even government spending programs take time. So suppose that the Congress had passed, just in their, right before the election, a big bill to rebuild the nation's crumbling infrastructure. Right? So $100 billion to rebuild highways, bridges, tunnels, aqueducts, levees, and so forth. Okay? The money has been appropriated. How long does it actually take before it begins to get spent? Right? So somebody's got to go out and do the environmental impact study. Somebody's got to let the contracts out. Somebody's got to hire all the workers and bring all the equipment in. Then you've got to get over this lawsuit, that lawsuit. You've got to do a lot of other things, and then construction begins. Right? It's by no means instantaneous. And that process can be relatively short, although it rarely is, and it can be relatively long. It can be as much as 18 to 36 months before you get the spending started. Right? So that's the implementation lag. How long does it take us to truly implement this policy? And then finally, we have to ask ourselves about how quickly, once we've changed policy and implemented it, does it take before it actually has an effect on the macroeconomy? Right? Notice, a tax cut doesn't have an effect on the macroeconomy until the money's spent. Government spending generally has an effect on the economy right away. Monetary policy, generally speaking, when you change interest rates, you do not get an immediate change in borrowing and lending activities. And therefore, you generally don't get an immediate impact in terms of spending or an effect on the overall economy. So it turns out when we look at these 5 lags, the data and recognition lag are basically the same for monetary and fiscal policy. The legislative and implementation lags are generally short for monetary policy, but long for fiscal policy. The effectiveness lag is generally short for